Hello and welcome to Strasbourg 1991 Productions for another Ideal Book Haul Ideas. I'm Nicholas Matovich. Ever since I was growing up, I ever thought CBS Evening News correspondents were some of the most loyal and some of the most endearing people I've ever actually heard of. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll just give you maybe my top 20 on the list, or top 24. The first book actually happens to be rather outspoken, A Land of the Lone Star with Mushy Politics. And no, I'm not talking about George H.W. or W. Bush. I'm talking about Dan Rather, who reported those former presidents over the years from 1981 to 2005 as the main anchorman. His famous "Good evening" from the CBS Evening News headquarters in New York sounded more grand than anything else. From topics that included Ronald Reagan to the final call to Alaskan Airlines Flight 261 were also some of the most unique stories I've ever heard of. But I also remember listening to Dan Rather and Rather Outspoken, and he was definitely a definition for through 3 or 4 wars he has covered. The Vietnam War, Persian Gulf, 9/11, pre-9/11, pre-Oklahoma City, Columbine, even Waco were also a few topics to choose from, and the Oklahoma City attacks. One of my favorite titled books with Dan Rather was something called Coffee After Hours, which basically is a rehash to another correspondent, Bob Scheafer, who has a nasally voice but also has the same history with growing up in the state of Texas. From everything from not the specifics in the war on politics, but something with the emphasis of looking to make excuses to the war on politics. Interesting. Bob Scheafer was another loyal friend of Dan Rather, and he's still living today. They're in their night. Actually, Dan Rather is 91. And Bob Scheafer, I believe, is 84, 85 right now, making 2 of the eldest of the elderly of news correspondents that worked for the news headquarters in New York. But then there's some retirees and people from everything from Jim Stewart, who reported the unfortunate events that took place in 2001 on American Airlines Flight 587 to crashing the Pentagon, and they would also find out exactly the war on terrorism and the war on drugs. Jim also had this very unique Chicago accent, and when he retired in 2006, he had a very loyal career, and he almost got in trouble with exposing confidential information about some of the parts about the war after 9/11, history with Abu Ghraib, the hazing scandal, in the prison, purely disgusting. And he's now living in Florida as a retiree. But then you have actually more bolder correspondents like Bob Orr with, "Did those warnings reach the pilots? How did Washington not alert the traffic controllers ahead of time that a hijacking might be imminent?" He had this bold characteristic of knowing exactly what he and Jim Stewart did in Washington. And my book was called Fatal Front Lines, Notorious Catastrophic on Capitol Hill. This is actually about the story about Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon, but because of its controversial image, it couldn't be released to the public. There was another story about the name Zaid Jarrah, was another example, Flight 93 that crashed south of Washington in Shanksville. There was also a story about Ground Zero in the movies and also in books, which Bob Orr had plans on writing. And then you have David Martin, who has this very cunning personality, knows about whether or not, when his famous titles were How will President Bush began to pull out the troops from Afghanistan before the Taliban act immediately, and not finding not only the members who were the disciples of Osama bin Laden, but the families of bin Laden and the extended families of Osama bin Laden as well. There were other stories of, Mullah Omar and the murder of Daniel Pearl, who was one of the journalists who was confirmed deceased. And then one of my other favorite books from an old 60 Minutes too, like Scott Pelley, who has so much intuition on factors of the story of the Columbine Massacre and so much other books that from 1999, Milosevic, and Ringing in the New Year, and the infamous stories to Alaskan Airlines Flight 261, which really showed the heart of what happens when aviation accidents and aviation inconsistencies go into the water. Well, Scott Pelley had this very unique voice, very quizzical, and one of my favorite things about Scott Pelley is that he was with the 60 Minutes 2 rehash starting from January 1999, which actually featured about, Milosevic and former Yugoslavia authorities. But I would recommend doing something more brighter, like Croatia, the capital of Zagreb, has been the faith of the Croatian citizens has been successfully restored. But I do not recommend those books unless if you're familiar with them. But if there were other books, whether your name was John Blackstone in San Francisco, or Wyatt Andrews, who was also a Washington correspondent, or Tom Fenton, or Mark Phillips in London, those correspondents were, to me, some of the best of the best of the best I've ever heard of. Same with Alan Pizzey, who was the veteran correspondent, originally from Tripoli. But with regarding to the war, drugs, politics, the freedom of speech, what really needs to emphasize with CBS News correspondents was their history and how well they were well-liked and well-mannered. Jerry Bowen and Mark Strassman and Jim Axelrod for the Weather Watch, Anthony Mason on the Market Watch, Bill Plante and John Roberts at the White House. I've always had this passion for CBS News anchors, and hopefully one day, one of the books that I would like to bring out is called Capitally Bonded Sovereigns, or how do you want to pronounce it? It's basically Capitally Bonded Solvents. Was basically about CBS anchors working together, negotiating together, even doing a 3-hour-long special where they had like 35 or more correspondents from all over the world, whether you're Randall Pinkston, Bill Whitaker, Byron Pitts, or whoever. It really showed what the meaning of courage really meant, and that's when I remember Courage Bonded Settlements, or Solutions, would be the new title name of every correspondent, past and present, even deceased, like Bruce Morton or Eric Ingberg. Just some titles to think about, but I do not recommend seeing the old books, but I do recommend looking at the old videos of 60 Minutes, 60 Minutes 2, 48 hours, a mystery, and Live to Tell. I do recommend you looking into some of those old clips, and they're some of the most interesting. But other than that, I'm very proud of how CBS News from the old years is a lot better because their professionalism and journalism hasn't been exactly the same like it was 20 plus or so years ago. But that's just my personal opinion. You don't have to take my word for it. But other than that, that's all I have to say. I hope there are some books about CBS News Anchorman, whether it's Dan Rather, Bob Scheiffer, John Roberts, or whoever. I salute to all of you with courage. And Dan Rather always says, for the CBS Evening News, headquarters in New York, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.